People in China took to the streets and to the internet for a third straight day to show their anger over alleged government censorship of the media. The publisher of a Beijing-based daily has announced his resignation in protest. Much of the focus has been on the Nanfang Zhoumo newspaper in the city of Guangzhou. About 300 people gathered on Wednesday at its headquarters. Reporters at the paper say local Communist Party officials forced them to change an editorial calling for greater democracy and freedom of speech.
Meanwhile, a Chinese newspaper has published its first issue since a strike last week. Journalists at the paper in Guangdong province walked out after an official rewrote an editorial which had called for political reform. And they only agreed to go back to work after the government said it would no longer censor articles. Keith Richburg is the bureau chief for the Washington Post in Beijing, and he says that editors at the newspaper are not letting up on the call for more media freedom.
This paper did come out today. Here's a typical story about an orphanage fire on the front. But if you look inside of it, buried back on page 30 or page 32, is a small notice, you might even miss it, saying basically that while we understand censorship has to continue in China, censorship must keep pace with the times. It seems to be kind of a coded message saying, look, guys, we understand that we're living in a one-party state. You're going to censor the news, but let's modernize it. Let's not be so intrusive. Let's not be so heavy-handed. And that's really kind of the message that a lot of the protesters are saying. They understand that we're not going to go completely to a free system here, but they really don't want to be treated like children. They want to be able to read things openly. Right now, obviously foreign news sites are blocked, and even the news that they are able to read here is just heavily controlled. And people are here saying, look, we're a little bit smarter than that now. We're a little more sophisticated than that now. Let us read and make decisions for ourselves.
It's very difficult to know because the agreement, the details of that agreement haven't been made public. What the journalists were calling for was that a propaganda chief in Guangdong province stepped down. That doesn't appear to have happened, but according to some reports, the journalists have returned to work after the authorities assured them that some of the controls on the newspaper would be lifted. It's worth pointing out that all media in China faces censorship. In many ways, this wasn't purely about government censorship. It was about the level of government censorship. But there are newspapers out there, particularly the Southern Weekly, which is trying to push back the boundaries of censorship in China. But that issue of freedom of speech, as we've seen today, with people being bundled into police vans, certainly hasn't gone away, and that will continue to be an issue for China's new leaders.
Protests in general in China are not unusual, but usually they are protests against social issues or perhaps environmental issues. But for a group of people, journalists in this case, to come out of their offices, go on strike, and then protest outside their offices, this is them behind me here, the office that is very unusual indeed. It started yesterday, and you mentioned this editorial. At the weekend, the newspaper published an editorial. It was a sort of year-ender, if you like, an op-ed piece that had been written, prepared in advance, but when it appeared in the newspaper, it wasn't what the journalists had written. It had been changed by the local propaganda party chief, the Communist Party chief in this area, to something quite different. They'd written an article in which they'd suggested or called for political reform, something the government has talked about many times in the past but never really done anything on. And yet when the article appeared in the paper, it was a big bit of puff for the Communist Party. And so I can't really spin the camera around now because of the type of connection we're on, but there was a large group of protesters, some of them journalists, some of them people who've just come down here to see what's going on and have then joined in. It's unusual because the police doesn't usually ever let this sort of thing happen. I've now got a policeman standing just off camera recording what we're doing and recording some of the people who've gathered here as well. That's the way the police are working at the moment. They're recording people, but they're not actually moving anyone on. The journalists themselves are inside the building working out what they're going to do next. But essentially, they are right now on strike. And this isn't just any old newspaper. It's a major newspaper, perhaps the most well-respected newspaper in China. So for them to go on strike is unusual. And I think it's a big worry for Beijing. Political protests are not something that the capital and that the Communist Party usually tolerates.